Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Ask GN. If you have questions for the next episode, post them in the comments section below, or if you're part of our Patreon Discord community, you can post them in the Ask GN channel, where I'll check before the next week. There have been a lot of questions since the last episode. We're going to answer a couple of them, and then I've got some sort of a monologue on the H700i versus the H500p and how product reviews work. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and NVIDIA with the Destiny 2 1080 Ti bundle. The 1080 Ti SC2 comes with asynchronous fan control for its dual fans, 9 thermal sensors, and again includes Destiny 2. Learn more at the link in the description below. So let's open with sort of a monologue on the H700i versus H500p case reviews. There's a comment I got that there were maybe 2 or 3 of them that stood out, and we get maybe one every 100 comments or so. But this one specifically said, Gamers Nexus, love how you bashed the H500p for thermals, but H700i was actually worse than thermals. So a couple things here. One, that's wrong. It's not worse than thermals, as the charts show. So to clear that up, if anyone thought the H700i was worse, it's probably because one chart had a variant of the H500p with the front panel completely removed. And in that instance, it was one of the best, if not the best, on the CPU torture thermals chart. So let's clear that up first. In stock-to-stock testing, the H500p is in fact objectively worse in thermals than the H700i. The gap is not that large, but the difference in criticism between the two cases was that one focused on the cooling aspect for the H500p, and the other focused on the smart aspect for the H700i. So let's talk about how we do reviews and why. For starters, let's start with marketing, and then we'll get into the rest. The marketing for the Cooler Master H500p case very directly stated in the review guide material sent to me that not only did the H500p position itself to have high volume airflow, it literally says that it guarantees high volume airflow. The same guide also suggests several times over, by no accident, that the H500p is a high airflow case, and they suggest different ways of testing that. On the consumer side, everyone knows the H500p is a half successor. So the case was marketed, and we had review guides sent to us saying it guarantees high airflow. Our job is to sit as a last line, a last filter between marketing and the consumer. So if the marketing is this thing is high airflow, my job is to validate that claim, which we did. And I'll talk about some of the differences in thermals in a moment. NZXT's marketing was that their case has intelligence and machine learning, and that it creates, using adaptive noise reduction, a better noise RPM thermal response curve than you would otherwise have. So then my job is to test this thing and see if it does. So you can understand then why for the H700i review we would focus on that aspect, and for the H500p review we'd focus on that one, the airflow. And I think, I'm pretty sure about 95% of the viewer base knows this, and it's just still worth talking about how we review products, because everyone's going to do it a little differently. And I'm not here to really debate about it, because it's just a core philosophy and it's not changing. But basically, the way I look at the products is, how was it marketed? How was it marketed to me before launch? How was it marketed to consumers, whether through direct marketing materials or indirectly through media coverage? Because maybe at a press event they told our team that the case does XYZ, and then we of course report that in the news write-up, and so now indirectly or otherwise the case is understood as doing X, Y, and Z. And so at this point we have to validate the claim when the product comes out and make sure it does do in fact X, Y, and Z, and does it as well as they've said it does. So that's how I view it. As for the thermal discussion, with case reviews, we again look at them how they're marketed. If Be Quiet came to us with a case and they said, this case is guaranteed to be low noise output. You are guaranteed to hear very little of the case volume. If we then test that and find that the case is middle of the stack, average 37 decibels for our test system, we're going to spend 10 minutes eviscerating it and probably start in the coverage by peeling the foam out of the case, much like we started this coverage with pulling the smart device out of the case, or like we started some of the H500P coverage with popping the glass out of the panel. The idea is, with each one, we're looking at what it says it does and then validating it. And sometimes the companies marketed their product appropriately and it's accurate, and other times it's not. So it's not just a thermal thing. Trying to poke holes in the review by saying you cared about thermals for this case but not this one is sort of misguided, because it misses the fact that marketing matters. And like for Be Quiet, again, for example, if Be Quiet had average thermals, but it were the quietest case on the bench, I wouldn't really make a big deal out of it, because the point is that it's quiet. And they're marketing it as a quiet case in this, this hypothetical scenario. So that's something to remember. And also, just to reiterate here, the other big point with the H700i and the H500P was, if you look at the unconstrained thermal performance, the H500P, when you remove the front panel completely, would drop 10 to 12 degrees Celsius on the CPU thermals. The H700i would drop about 6.3, exactly 6.3 actually, and about 5 for the GPU. So the H700i, with its front panel design, is pretty close to its maximum potential for the stock fan configuration it has with our test system, whereas the H500P, the Cooler Master case, was 12 degrees away from its maximum potential. And then when we replaced the front panel with mesh, we got it to about 8 degrees improvement. So the difference there being that now you are maybe, I can't remember if it was 2 to 4 degrees away from max panel-less potential versus the mesh, because you're still fighting a mesh, so you've got static pressure to consider for those big fans, as opposed to 12 degrees away. So what we're looking at there isn't necessarily outright thermal performance of which one's better, and the H700i, again, was better anyway, but we're not really looking at that. What we're looking at is, how bad is the panel design, or how good is the panel design? And in case A versus B, if one is pretty close to max potential, that's not a bad panel design in terms of airflow. So this goes back to a discussion of thermals aren't some magical number that you just apply to things or gets assigned to them like a score from Firestrike. It depends very much on every single component in the bench, how it's tested, what software is used to test it, is it AVX or not, is it a fixed power load, or is it modulating, are you using liquid or air, which has an impact on how long it takes to ramp thermals, what materials are is the case made out of, because that'll impact kind of how long it hangs on to its temperature as well. So yeah, lots of stuff to think about here in terms of how reviews work for us. But I wanted to point those out because it seemed like people were upset that I hurt their feelings about the H500P in a couple cases. It was not that common, but it was common enough that I thought, you know, we should talk about how we review products. So people were upset that the H500P didn't get a good review, and you know, the H700i didn't necessarily get a good review either. We just said it's a good case that they ruined with this, and the H500P really had a lot more problems than the airflow. So that's the other thing. I mean, like, panel quality is very cheap. It doesn't innovate features. It doesn't do anything impressive and new, and it countered its own marketing. So that's kind of the difference. It's more than just airflow is the point here. It's everything. And the H500P advertised airflow, so it got a lot of focus, but it also had a lot of other flaws. It still looks okay, but like we said in the H500P review, you know, if you like how it looks, great, go buy it. But otherwise, there's all the information. So just wanted to address how a review works from my perspective. So let's get into the questions. The first one is from Discord, Unilythe, who said, Steve, you say about some games that an overclocked GPU doesn't work well with it. What does this mean exactly? What happens if you do have an overclocked GPU, and what would cause these problems? I said this in the 1070 Ti review to give everyone some a point of reference. So For Honor specifically, that game, there are a couple others. For Honor specifically behaves very oddly with clocks. It's not a clock fluctuation or modulation. What it is we can apply a 225 megahertz offset to the colorful 1070 Ti reviewed and have it stable in every game that we test otherwise. Firestrike, everything like that. You play For Honor, and what happens, and to some extent Ghost Recon, both Ubisoft, For Honor with a 225 megahertz offset, as we've shown in the past with this particular card, is micro stuttering. It's so bad that your frame times just have huge latencies between them, so you end up with something like an 11 0.1% low value in our converted charts. And that's happening, I think, because For Honor seems to enumerate the clock a little bit higher than other games. So I think having those bigger OCs on it pushes it beyond the card's capabilities in a way that other games don't seem to. They don't seem to create that scenario. So it's a very specific game for it. So the 1070 SC, off the top of my head, we had a much bigger overclock for other games, then we dropped it to something like a 25, 50, maybe 50 or I don't know, somewhere in a sub 100 megahertz offset. And that was because it had way worse performance otherwise in For Honor. Now, if you look at our Ghost Recon Wildlands charts from the 1070 Ti review, you'll also notice that the 1070 Ti, when overclocked, although it has higher averages, actually had lower 0.1% low values. The overclock was not unstable. I think that's a misconception. That's pretty common. It was not an unstable overclock, and in fact, the clock was sustained almost perfectly flat. So that wasn't the problem either. But because of the game works, we're running into some other kind of limitation. I don't know what that one specifically is, but sometimes it can be power, where you're power throttling really hard on occasion, although you tend to see that reflected in the clock rate. Or it could just be that you're on the precipice of instability with that game to the point where your frame times look worse, but your average looks better, which goes back to why we do things with frame times. So yeah, basically you just keep an eye out for micro stutter and for what people would call stutters in general, and your average might be higher, but behind the scenes there might be actually worse performance overall. And it's just on a game-by-game basis, and I don't know why it always happens. But next question is from Shiba, who I think posted on YouTube and said, "Hey Steve, question for next Ask GN. Since placing AIOs at the top of a case as exhaust is now common practice, would it be practical to use the rear fan as intake? In theory, it should help with VRM cooling and keeping a positive air pressure, and you could probably use a magnetic air filter. Thanks." So yeah, I'm going to take this question and modify the answer to be a little less direct about that. We've done testing with top intake in cases in the past, years ago at this point for the most part, and you can actually end up with better performance. I know you said rear intake, but with top intake, you've got something directly above the cooler if you have a tower cooler and above the VRM. You get air over both those things. Your problem becomes dust, of course, through the top, but hopefully you can deal with it with a filter. Rear intake, I can't say that I've actually done any objective numbers testing on that. The problem is, I guess, well, if you have a CLC, you avoid the problem of creating a vortex or conflicting airflow. So you avoid that problem. But yeah, you would get air over the VRMs. It's going to be cooler air than what the VRMs are generating for a heat output, but or power output, I should say. But I think I would try and do a top intake instead if possible, unless that slot's taken by your CLC. Because if you kind of think about it, a lot of the times the back of a case for people is really close to a wall. It's not going to have the most airflow there, the most access to air, and the GPU being lower in the case is, if it's a blower card especially, but generally there's heat coming out from the back of the case that's going to be lower than the top rear exhaust would be. So you've got power supply exhaust, you have GPU exhaust, and those things will kind of just get sucked back into the system. And that air is still going to be cooler than what's in the case, most likely. It's diffusing as soon as it exits the case. But I think optimally you do top intake if you're concerned about VRM temperatures. We'll have more on VRM temperatures very soon. Next question. Actually, I should mention this too before people fight in the comments over it. Heat rises, yes, but not really a relevant amount. We've talked about this before. So there are reasons to do top intake or exhaust that do not have to do with the fact that heat rises, because heat may rise, but as we said in an old AskGN, it's irrelevant when you're blasting air with 1,000 RPM fan. It's such a small amount of heat rising from natural physics that I would not let that factor into where you're placing your fans. You put your fans where you need airflow, and that's the end of the story. Don't worry about how heat moves, because it's really not going to play into it. Next question, gornn. Why don't we see broader use of USB-C in the desktop enthusiast market? Seems the trend in the laptop world, both PC and Mac, so is there some reason why USB-C's promise of one connection to rule them all shouldn't take off for desktops? I don't have a great answer for this, but I think that we're seeing it more in motherboards now. You really need to see it in cases though. And I think for cases to start implementing USB-C required a few things. One is they needed motherboards to start implementing it. It's a chain reaction. They can't really lead that charge. They need the motherboard vendors to lead it. And two, the other thing to consider is that cases have often a multi-year production cycle, and a lot of companies kind of buy the older used tooling from companies that are bigger than them, from OEMs and suppliers, and those things aren't necessarily updated for several years at a time. The RL05 tooling is still used like 4 years later. So it'll take a while for the cases to kind of catch up, because things that are on like a multi-year production cycle, it doesn't seem like it's hard to change and add USB Type-C in there. But if they have to change like the molding or anything like that, the cost might just be prohibitive, or maybe they've already started production. I think you'll see more of it towards Computex this year. That should kind of be around when the cycle refreshes again. Next question, DaveJ. Regarding liquid metal, Tim, have you looked into corrosion concerns? I've read that the gallium alloy used in liquid metal reacts negatively with most metals, especially aluminum and copper, potentially causing damage and poor performance long term. Have you considered testing this out yourself? And is liquid metal safe over long term for delidded CPUs? I have not tested it myself. I can tell you that some liquid metals like conductonaut should absolutely not be used with an aluminum heatsink, because they will destroy it. Like, it'll corrode. So just read the package. They should say when there's a metal that they definitely don't work with. Conductonaut makes it really clear in their materials that come with the liquid metal that you absolutely should not use it with aluminum. I haven't tried the other liquid metals. Cool Labs I haven't really used, so I don't know how those are for long-term use. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can really speak to here with any level of authority is that just don't use them with aluminum coolers. Copper, I don't directly, I have not used any that corrode copper, but we'll see if that comes up in the future. Next question is Arrhythmix. Just out of curiosity, would it be possible to test CPU to GPU or vice versa contribution to contaminating each other's thermals? As most of us already know, poor airflow increases internal temperatures, which in effect increases CPU and GPU temperatures as a result. My question is, how much do they impact each other? Long story short. Yeah, so our case reviews, the torture tests are CPU and GPU burn-in, and 3D Mark is a lighter version of CPU and GPU burn-in. And then you can look at our new Blender tests instituted this year, where we do a Blender CPU workload that's only on the CPU and a Blender GPU workload that's only on the GPU, and that will help you understand how the two impact each other. But yeah, if you're running a torture on each, it gets a lot hotter, hence the name torture test, because obviously if a GPU is spewing heat inside of a case, the CPU is going to be pulling that back through its own cooler. So we do actually account for that in our case reviews. Just if you didn't already know that, that's why all those different charts are there, because they tell you slightly different information. A couple more, maybe one or two more here. Let's see, let's do, this one's fast. Commander Powell, what's the deal with faulty TR4 sockets and how can the consumer avoid them? We had this problem at PAX when we did a Cooler Master C700P build. Basically, take your Torx wrench that is provided with the Threadripper CPU, locate the Torx screws that are on the outer flank of the socket, not the one for the CPU mount, but the outer ones, and then tighten them until the wrench clicks. They are the same torque spec as the CPU. That's how you know if yours are loose or not, and that's how you avoid them. You just, before you build the system, tighten those down. I actually have had to do it to a couple boards myself. So next question is, let's see, this one is very fast as well, because I'm going to be reading an answer from BuildZoid. samualcc said, long-time listener, first-time backer. This is on Patreon, thank you. The question basically is, what's the difference between fixed voltage and adaptive voltage for overclocking? That's kind of the crux of it. So I sent the whole question over to BuildZoid. BuildZoid said both me and Roman, that's Der Bauer, have done tests on idle power draw using fixed versus adaptive voltage. You save like 10 to 30 watts depending on the CPU, and then he says actually less, 10 to 30 watts at the wall. And he also says basically it makes little to no difference on mainstream CPUs. On a thing like the Intel high-end desktop platforms, it makes more of a difference. So that's what I've got for you on that one. I use manual voltage personally, so I actually haven't really messed with adaptive. Last question. Atilolzz, Atilolzz says, important question, do you have more cats? Yes. I don't know if we took a shot of Midnight not too long ago. If we can find it, we'll put it in. Thank you for watching. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or join the Patreon backer Discord, store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one or one of our new stickers, and subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.